morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank Shannon and the organizers for just this amazing conferences. 10 years is phenomenal that these conversations have been unfolding, these vital conversations. I'm very honored as well to be a guest on the lands of the Tunica Biloxi, so thank you for hosting us. We're really honored to be here. A good colleague, friend, mentor, elder that came into my life some 25 years ago, Lee Kiwanuisioma, used to talk about growing up on the Hopi Reservation. He was born in Pakavi on Third Mesa, born into the Greasewood clan. And he would talk about how his grandfather, he would go out to the farm fields. He was a sheep herder and farmer, and he would go out to plant corn every spring. And the instructions every year from his grandfather was, when you get to the end of the row, take a look back. And growing up as a young boy, Lee would talk about how for him this meant, take a look at your row. Where are you planting your seeds? And being very intentional as a farmer. But as he grew older, he realized that his grandfather was offering a larger message of ensuring that if you want to know where you're going, you have to look backwards. You have to look at your past. You have to look at where you came from, and you have to look at where you are. And this was a message that resonated deeply in Lee's life, and he would share it with many people, including young anthropologists who were eager to collaborate with him, because it was a point about how we all need to honor our history and our cultures, where we come from, in order to understand where we're going. I start with that story because when I was so kindly invited to come here today, I was really unsure that I could accept, because I didn't really know what I would say, to be honest. And I realized as I thought about the invitation that almost everything I would have to say came from the communities that were kind enough to host me and work with me, and especially the elders who have taught me so much through the years. And so today, in the next 45 minutes or so, I hope to share with you my own journey of repatriation and the work I've done, but I would especially like to honor the people who have guided me the most, the elders that I've worked with, the knowledge keepers, and the people that I've worked with through the years, whose lives have so shaped my own experiences, and whose wisdom I truly turn to every day. So hopefully, I'll be able to pay homage to many of the people, not all of them, but because there have been so many through the years, but some of the most important ones in my life. Some of them are actually even here at this conference, so it'll be so good to see you. Thank you for being here as well. And hopefully we can also, throughout the day, learn more and more about repatriation and the important work that we're all doing together. So I think one of the overarching values shared by so many of the elders that I've worked with through the years is just an utter awe and wonder about Native history across the millennia. That if we go back to the beginning of time, to time immemorial, that we see Native history involves the survival across all different epochs and different ways of survival, from being hunters of mammoths to being people who survived dramatic and fundamental climate change, both incredible cold, incredible heat, incredible dryness, incredible drought, and yet survival has always been the center of Native lifeways for thousands and thousands of years. And that Native ancestors lived for thousands of years so in tune with the land that they have left just such a light footprint that all we can see for thousands of years is their traces in stone and scatters of rocks in many parts of North America. and that their ancestors helped bring corn into the world some 5,000 years ago, the gift of life, and joined corn in the union of squash and beans. That they built massive, breathtaking earthworks and vast canals for fishing and watering fields, and a philosophy of life's purpose, what some anthropologists or others would call religion, and ingrained their beliefs into the land itself. That they were and are brilliant inventors, from kayaks to lacrosse and other games, pottery, snowshoes, calendars and counting time, medicines, clothing. That they were architects and builders, melding stone and earth and water into citadels that lasted centuries. And that they invented political systems such as democracy, which we still have so much to learn from today. And so one of the first wisdoms that I have grown to cherish over the years is that when we look back, we can see for millennia since time immemorial, Native people have not merely survived, but thrived and endured. And of course, one of the greatest challenges to Native peoples arrived with European colonialists and imperialists in the 1500s and 1600s in North America especially. And notably, some of the first Europeans in their acts of colonialisms, in their aspiration for conquest, was the act of extraction. And aside from the extraction of labor and minerals and timber and everything else that was available on the land to them, they also wanted to extract Native people's remains and their belongings. And it's so tragic, but also so important to recognize that in the very first acts of arrival, Europeans undertook this form of looting. As early as 1620, when the Pilgrims first arrived in what's now Massachusetts, they were starving and looking for food, and they began to search out food across the land and came across a native village. There, they started to dig, trying to find food, but instead they found graves. And even in their desperation, rather than leaving those graves alone, they looted them of some of the belongings that were left there. And this nefarious tradition of extraction and looting, of course, we all know in this room, continued for a very long time. I find this quote from George Dorsey, who through the years has been celebrated as a famed anthropologist, so fundamentally disturbing, but also so perfectly capturing this attitude of extraction that lasted for so long, in which it was believed that anthropologists and others could come to native lands and take whatever it is they wanted to extract, whatever it is they wished, however they wished to take it. But notably, Native peoples, when they discovered these acts of plunder and looting, often stood up to resist, very often. This is one of the earliest examples that I found in the written record. I've worked mostly in the Southwest, so some of these, I lean a little bit to the US Southwest in some of these examples. But I've tried to document as much as I can these acts of resistance through the years. And this is a very early one in 1883, in which Apache warriors arrived at Fort Apache in Arizona once they discovered that some cavalrymen had stolen and looted some sacred items from a cave. There's also the example of the Hopi tribe's resistance to archaeology in the late 1800s. Jesse Walter Fuchs, again, a supposedly famed anthropologist, tried to and conducted excavations at a number of ancestral sites in northern Arizona. And again and again and again, as Hopi elders and leaders realized what was happening in these excavations, this science that they'd never heard of or experienced before, when they realized that what it entailed included especially the excavation of their ancestors' remains, they tried again and again to prevent archaeology from unfolding on their lands. And it wasn't just archaeology, it was also when sacred items were taken from shrines, from cave sites, from community members themselves, that Hopi leaders did everything they could in their power to prevent those acts of theft and to reclaim those items and ancestors. Another example, an excavation was conducted in 1902 on Long Island in New York, and the local Assiniboine tribal members, when they discovered the archaeologists at work, again tried to prevent them. Carl Lumholtz, pith helmet and all, tried to take many sacred items from Native peoples across the Southwest, including the Tana Atum. And when his acts of theft and removal were discovered, Native peoples themselves tried to prevent these removals. In 1902, excavations were conducted at Puye in New Mexico. And there too, Santa Clara Pueblo tribal members tried to stop the diggings on their land. We also see by the early mid-1900s, Native peoples conducting acts of repatriation. The word didn't even exist yet, and that Native peoples were reclaiming these items. One of the first major repatriations that I'm aware of took place in 1937 when Hidatsa elders learned of the theft of sacred bundles from their lands and were successfully able to petition the Museum of the American Indian to have those reclaimed. In 1942, the Tana Atum Nation refused one of the preeminent archaeologists of the time, Emil Houry's proposed excavations at a cave site, one of their most sacred caves, on one of the most sacred peaks on their lands. In the 1960s, the Haudenosaunee sought and successfully received back wampum belts and other items that were sacred to them that they had been trying to get back for decades and decades, but successfully were able to get items back from New York museums. And then you have Maria Pearson. Maria Pearson was Yankton Sioux, and she was not an activist. She did not come from a family in which one would expect vociferous protest. But in 1971, she was a mother of 3, and one night she was preparing dinner for her family, and her husband, who was a civil engineer, came home from work and told her, "I have some news, but I don't think you're gonna like it." And she said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, we're working on this highway, and the construction crew found some human bones, and so archaeologists were called out, and they've been excavating these graves. And as they've excavated these graves, they decided that 26 of these people in this cemetery that was accidentally discovered were white settlers. And so those people were taken and reburied immediately at the cemetery, the local cemetery. The 27th person was presumed to be a young woman, a young Native woman. Her remains were boxed up, and instead of being taken to the cemetery, were taken to the office of the state archaeologist. So here you had a group of people all buried in the same place, even at the same time, all within a cemetery, and they were treated differently only because one person was deemed to be Native American and the others were deemed to be non-Native. They were thought to be white settlers. And what's really fundamental at this moment is that what the archaeologists did was, of course, wrong, but it was wrong because it was the law, Iowa state law, that deemed Native American remains as archaeological resources of the state. So when Maria Pearson learned of this injustice and this unequal treatment of her ancestors, She single-handedly drove to the office of the governor of Iowa, insisted on seeing him, essentially kind of burst into his office and convinced him of the injustice of this law and that things had to change. And so she and a coalition of scholars and archaeologists and also other Native activists then began to change the laws, and Iowa became one of the first states to give equal rights to Native peoples, not only in life, but also in death. And many other acts of protest followed. Again, I can't unfortunately cover many of them, but there were so many. This is one of that's a bit closer to my home in Denver. At Colorado State University, activists burst into an anthropology classroom where a professor was using Native American human remains, ancestral remains, in the class, and the activists attempted a citizen's arrest of the professor for grave looting. Many other tribes also in this time in the 1970s began quietly but steadily seeking the return of stolen items and ancestors. The Zuni tribe was one of the first to reclaim the Ahayuda, sacred beings known in English sometimes as keepers of the sky. And they began a systematic campaign to reclaim those beings that were captured and imprisoned in museums. And starting in the 70s, began a very successful string of repatriations. There's also artists that joined the movement. James Luna was, to my mind, among the most important, and he was also an elder whom I cherished as I got to know him over the years. He's most famous for this 1987 performance art piece he did called the Artifact piece, in which he laid for 8 hours a day in a glass case as his life was dissected and interpreted around him in the way archaeologists and anthropologists and other scholars had done of Native peoples for centuries. And it was an act of protest, but it was also the most powerful form of object lessons, in which it pointed to the way Native peoples have been so systematically objectified in museums, and the way that those acts marginalize real living Native peoples. And there were those that sought change at the level of law and our legal system. People like Suzanne Schoen-Harjo, Cormac Adams. They together and with many others put together some of the first legislation that today defines our work in repatriation. They signed of course, the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which included repatriation provisions in 1989. And on its heels followed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990. And one of the lessons I've learned from many of the elders who've helped me understand these histories and have wanted me to share them is that, yes, these are acts of resistance, but even more, these are acts of resilience. With the birth of NAGPRA, this is where I began my career as initially an archaeologist, an aspiring archaeologist. When NAGPRA passed into law, I was still in high school. And I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and had a deep passion for history and culture. This was fed by some of my early school teachers. And when I arrived in high school, I was very lucky to meet Elliot Lax, here pictured on the lower right, who was a failed archaeologist. He did not proceed with his, he was planning to get a PhD in archaeology and didn't quite pass his exams, so ended up teaching high school chemistry and convinced the administration to let him teach an anthropology class. So that's where I was first introduced to the field of anthropology, and I really fell in love with it. It was the way for me to build an understanding of my world, my home, through this academic discipline. And so I went to first Pima Community College and then University of Arizona. I spent a lot of time in museums, started going out on digs. But this was the early 90s, and as I began to learn more about the field, more about its history, and more about repatriation, I became more and more unsettled by this field I was aspiring to join. Now, there are many problems with archaeology, I came to learn, many problems with anthropology and museums. But for me, I think the greatest paradox, the thing that was the hardest for me to wrap my mind around, was how so many archaeologists at that time could be so resistant to repatriation and NAGPRA. And what bothered me at the core was the way in which archaeologists were spending their entire lives, right? Entire lives, decades and decades, getting grants and writing books, all to understand Native Americans from the past. How could these same people care so little, seem to care so little, about Native peoples living today? So I was close enough to getting my degree, so I went ahead and got it, but I resolved at that time to leave the field, to go do something else, and I had the opportunity to travel a bit. And in those travels, I went to South Africa, and there I went to Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for almost 3 decades. And with that visit, it hit me like a kind of slap to the face that, here was someone who fought his entire life, literally went to prison for his beliefs. And here was I, someone with so much privilege who'd found a problem in the world, and instead of doing my best to try to solve it and be a part of the solution, I was running away from it. And so with that, I resolved to go back to graduate school and pursue anthropology with the goal of trying to bridge these worlds that had seemed so divided. I had the good fortune to end up doing dissertation work at Archaeology Southwest. If you met Steve Nash yesterday, he is now the president and CEO. The first CEO and president was Bill Doley, and I worked with TJ Ferguson there as well on a project to understand the tribal histories of the San Pedro Valley in southeastern Arizona. And it was through that work that I began to meet many Native tradition keepers and elders and community leaders and community experts, and whose knowledge, wealth of knowledge and wisdom really profoundly shaped my career and my life, and for which I'm so grateful. So again, I can't highlight all of them, but I did want to highlight a few, especially a few that we've lost in now the last few years. One spectacular human being and very special person is Bernard Siqueiros, who belonged to the Tana O'Atum Nation. And I learned so much from him right from the very start. I met him, and TJ and I were trying to talk about the San Pedro Valley project, and he invited us to meet the tribal council to see if we could get permission to work with the tribe, to work with the nation. And we were in front of the council in a meeting, and one of the first questions Bernard asked was, okay, it's clear, how this is going to help you. You're going to get a dissertation, you're probably going to get some money, some grants to do this work, you're going to get some publications, but how is this going to help us? What are the benefits that are going to flow back to us? And that was a very important lesson for young aspiring anthropologists to learn right out of the gate, one of the very first meetings I had with tribal council representatives. And through the work, through those collaborations, I learned the value of mutual benefit, of true collaboration, of finding ways in which everyone is seeking common goals and shared benefits. Bernard was also just someone who loved history and loved life. Some of you may even know him here in this room. We once went to Mexico to follow the Salt Trail, which is a very sacred pilgrimage made for centuries from parts of the Southwest to the Gulf. He would just want to go out and explore and learn as much as he possibly could. He also was an amazing PowerPoint presenter, so everything I've learned from PowerPoint comes from Bernard. But he also had a lot of humor and joy. One of my favorite kind of little stories to illustrate this about him is that when I was a curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we had an Indigenous Fellowship program, and he came and he hadn't really ever used the term Indigenous for himself, and he thought it was quite amusing, so he would go around to everyone in the museum and say, "Hello, I'm an Indigenous Fellow." Using kind of the double meaning of that word. It was really hilarious. He was so warm and kind and generous, and truly he'll live in so many hearts for so long. We've also recently just lost Lee J. Kiwanisioma of the Hopi Nation. He was also just a force to be reckoned with. He fought so hard for Hopi history, heritage, language, culture, and so much more. Everything from the Grand Canyon, the biggest places, some of the most common places that we all know of, that we cherish, to some of the smallest, most important places. He spent a couple years fighting for just one single shrine, a very, very important shrine, but one shrine that was threatened by a gravel pit mining operation. So from the smallest part of Hopi heritage to the largest, he was an incredible fighter. He was also deeply involved in repatriation. He returned and reburied himself more than 8,000 ancestors. He would often speak of the spiritual toll that took on him and the people that he worked with, and I think he would recognize so many of you in this room. And yet he continued. He didn't give up, even to the end. He also had a sharp sense of humor. On his doorway at the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, which he had founded and ran for about 30 years, he had a sign that said, "This is not Burger King. You can't have it your way." And another that I think people here would appreciate especially is that consultation is not consent. Consultation is not consent. Yes, right? So I worked in Tucson for a number of years, and in 2007 I had the opportunity to be hired as a curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where I had the privilege and honor to work with many great leaders and elders who very quickly shared with me a desire to do the right thing in the world of repatriation. One of the first things that we were able to do together, and it wasn't just the people, as you know, for any of you who've done this kind of work, there's so many people involved, so it's not only those elders and leaders that I highlight, but so many from the ground up that also are doing the work. But together, as an institution, we had the opportunity to revise our collection policies shortly after my arrival, and shortly after Steve Nash's arrival as well. And together we created language that emphasized that, yes, if you look at a lot of collection policies in NAGPRA, it's kind of like the letter of the law. Yes, there is the letter of the law. This is in part why we are doing it, but it's also the spirit of the law that's important to recognize, that the consultations that we would be doing had to be on the equal footing and open communication, and that the principles of respect, reciprocity, equal exchange, justice, and dialogue had to be used as part of this process as well. And so you can see how the lessons that I learned from people like Lee and Bernard from those early years even were already being enfolded into policy at the museum level. And because of those commitments on paper, but also more broadly amongst our museum colleagues at the Denver Museum, we really got to work on NAGPRA. When Steve had arrived there in 2006, the museum was out of compliance. Some work had already started by his predecessor in 2004, but it was really in that period of 2007, 2008 that we recommitted the institution to getting on track with compliance. And we were able to do it pretty quickly by just focusing our energy and resources on that work. And as Shannon mentioned, after we finished the work of those ancestors that we needed to address because they were out of compliance, those were mostly ancestors that we could culturally affiliate with modern day tribes. We then turned to the so-called culturally unaffiliated or culturally unidentifiable ancestors. And this was prior to the 2010 revisions of the regulations that provided a process, a clearer process for mechanisms to return so-called unaffiliated or unidentifiable ancestors. And it was really hard work at first, but especially through the leadership of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and Southern Ute Tribe, which was Colorado's federally recognized tribes, and others, we made real progress very quickly. And after we had completed the work with the so-called unaffiliated ancestors, we still had about 20 people that we had reason to believe, based on our records and otherwise, that these were Native American people under the law and therefore subject to NAGPRA. But we had no information, no even state level, county level information, no possible tribal affiliation at all. And as an institution, as individuals, we were really disturbed by this idea that these people were just gonna have to sit on a shelf for who knows how long because we didn't have mechanisms, legal mechanisms, to address people who were categorized merely only as Native American but had no other information attached to them. And so, as again Shannon mentioned, what we decided to do was to try to reach out to every federally recognized tribe, every Native Hawaiian organization we could find, and every Native Alaskan community as well. And so we ended up communicating with about 800 tribes, Native American communities, Native Alaskan communities, Native Hawaiian organizations, to try to come to an agreement on what should happen with these 20 ancestors. And again, under the leadership of the Ute Mountain Ute tribes, especially Terry Knight, the Colorado tribes took responsibility for the reburial of these ancestors on behalf of dozens and dozens of tribes and Native Hawaiians and Native Alaskans who consented and agreed to the final resting place of these ancestors. And given what we learned about the deeply felt connections between living peoples and their ancestors through NAGPRA, given the broader ethical claims by descendant communities against museums, given the history of looting and extraction that we know have led to so many of collections of people in museums, we didn't want to stop at NAGPRA, at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So we continued on with looking at all of the human remains in the collection for which we did not have consent. And so this included 27 more people who we believed were not Native American, but we still wanted to address their fate. And so we got together a community board that did include Native representation, but also included a range of religious beliefs and practices, atheists, scientists, and others. And we tried to work towards an agreement on what should happen with these 27 people. And everyone did agree that they should be buried at a natural cemetery site in Colorado. And so we completed that work some years ago. Likewise, we didn't want to limit NAGPRA and what we learned from NAGPRA when it came to sacred belongings, sacred items, and communally owned belongings and items. We didn't want to limit that policy to Native peoples because, again, we had many histories embedded within the museum of extraction and looting and removal without consent. One of the most prominent cases that we pursued at Denver was the return of Vigango. These are memorial statues that are placed in honor of ancestors who passed in a religious society called the Gohu Society. And this is a practice of the Mijikenda people of Kenya, predominantly Kenya. And 30 of these statues we knew had been just flat out stolen and flown to an art gallery in Hollywood, sold to eminent actors and Hollywood types, and then donated to unsuspecting museums as part of a tax fraud scheme in which the donor would then receive more money in their donation than what they'd paid for at the art gallery. So when we realized that this had happened and that we were complicit in this at Denver with these 30 memorial statues, we proceeded to try to reach out to cultural leaders and political leaders in Kenya. And finally, in 2014, we were able to come to an agreement on the return of these items to Kenya. And it took a couple more years for various bureaucratic reasons, but eventually these items made their way back to Kenya and to the communities. And Steve has made the trip to Kenya and could speak more about this, has really taken a lead role on the legacy and kind of the wake of these repatriations. I would also like to honor the work of Octavius Seautua, and I believe Octavius is here. I'm not quite seeing it. Octavius, are you here this morning? Okay, guess he's sleeping in. So anyways, keep an eye out for Octavius, as I know he's here. And Octavius and I started to work together in 2001 and have learned so much from him. He is a member of the Zuni tribe and a leader of many of the religious fraternities and communities, organizations within the tribe, and has been very active in repatriation work, especially in the last decade or so. In 2014, we had, Octavius and I had the opportunity to travel across Europe to continue the work, try to continue the work of reclaiming the Aha Yuda, and pictures I'm using with Octavius's permission here, of the Aha Yuda, the sacred beings that have been systematically stolen from Zuni shrines over the decades. And essentially every known Aha Yuda in the United States has been returned. In the formation of NAGPRA, the Aha Yuda was used as an example, as a kind of paragon of a sacred object and object of cultural patrimony under NAGPRA. So basically, any public institution that has had an Aha Yuda has returned them at this point. But as we'll talk about later today with international repatriations, there's of course no laws, there's no mechanism by which the Zuni tribe can reclaim the Aha Yuda from museums outside the United States, those institutions outside the purview of NAGPRA. So Octavius and I did a small tour of Europe, visiting about 6-7 institutions that have Aha Yuda, and tried to engage in a dialogue. And we experienced everything from, in the Netherlands, a very sympathetic appreciation for the claim and wanting to try to find a way forward, to Germany, where we found very sympathetic staff and curators, but because the collections are nationalized, it makes claims very complicated, because apparently the claims would have had to have gone through the highest levels of government, to the Musée de Quai Branly in France, where we met the director of collections, who, after Octavius very patiently and kindly explained the significance of the Aha Yuda to the Zuni people, the director paused and said, "But these are art." So he insisted that these are art. rather than sacred beings of the Zuni people, and the Zuni people had a right to reclaim them. So it was through those experiences that I learned so much about the international issues facing tribal communities, and especially the battles that Octavius and so many others are undertaking. We returned home a bit saddened, I would say, by the journey and the fact that there wasn't going to be many clear opportunities for return. Octavius his father had recently passed and wasn't going to make the journey, really made such an effort to be there. And it felt like at the end of it, not to have any ahayuda, have a clear path home, felt like we'd failed a bit. As part of our tour, we happened to have met a journalist, and she ended up writing an article about the trip. And about a week after the trip, I received an email from someone saying that they'd seen the New York Times article, and they had some items that their family lore had said that they were always, that they were Zuni religious items. And this woman's father, who had collected them, had never been able to convince her father to return them, and her father had recently passed, and now she wanted to return them. And if anyone works in museums, you get these kinds of emails pretty frequently, and I was like, yeah, sure, send me pictures, I'll take a look. And she sent me pictures, I sent them to Octavius, and he called right away within minutes and said, I have been looking for these for 40 years. And so the way the events unfolded was because of this article, this woman realized who Octavius was and the work he'd done, and that these were items that were actively being used on altars in religious ceremonies, and were stolen and sold on the market. And this family was now ready to return them. And they flew Octavius out to Los Angeles and were able to return these items, and Octavius and the Galaxy Fraternity have since put them back into their religious purpose. And so in conclusion, it's so hard after now 25 years of this work, of putting everything I've learned, so much of what I've learned, into a few bullet points. But for me, these are some of the most important lessons that I carry in my heart every day in the work that I do. And it's that Native America is born of a history of profound breadth and depth and beauty and wonder, that the injustices are long, yet long battled, that resilience is brother to resistance, that we are making progress slow yet sure on the winding path of justice, and that the land and ancestors will provide care and strength. And I would like to end with the words of Lee Kiwanui-Sioma, who once said, "Our ancestors left footprints across this land, and it is our duty to ensure those footprints are not erased. We must carry forward what they taught us and make sure that when the next generation looks back, they will see that we honored their legacy." Thank you.